The auction hammer fell with a crack that sounded like a breaking bone. $50 for an entire motel. Cassidy Flynn scanned the empty auction house, his gaze landing on the auctioneer. The man's eyes weren't triumphant. They weren't businesslike. They were full of pity. And that was the first sign that something was terribly wrong. "Congratulations," the auctioneer mumbled, sliding the deed across the table. His voice was flat, hollow. "You just bought the Desert Rose Motel." The name sounded nice enough. The reality was not. The motel sprawled in the desert heat like a wounded animal. Adobe walls, faded and peeling. Windows boarded up like sealed eyes. And a broken neon sign that once said Desert Rose now just flickered two words: Dr. E. It was a ghost of a place, but it wasn't the building that made Cassidy's blood run cold. It was Duke. The moment his German shepherd's paws hit the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, the dog began to shake. A deep, uncontrollable tremor that ran through his whole body. Now, you have to understand, Duke wasn't afraid of anything. This was a dog that had faced down rattlesnakes without flinching. A dog that had stood his ground against a mountain lion. A dog that watched lightning split trees in half and just yawned. But here, in this dead quiet parking lot, holding a $50 deed, Cassidy watched his fearless companion tremble with a primal terror he had never seen before. Duke's eyes were locked on the main office building. And Cassidy had no idea why. The key felt like a shard of ice in his palm. It was old, brass, but it was clean. Too clean. He walked toward the main office door, each step feeling heavier than the last. Duke stayed 3 paces behind him, not walking, but slinking. His massive 140-pound frame was coiled tight as a spring. The dog's usual confident stride was gone, replaced by a ghost-like silence on the broken concrete. This wasn't caution. This was fear. Cassidy reached for the door handle, expecting it to be rusted shut. But it turned. It turned with a smooth, silent ease. No resistance. No grating sound of old metal. Someone had been oiling this lock. Recently. A cold dread trickled down Cassidy's spine. He pushed the door open. Duke let out a low, gut-wrenching whine, a sound that echoed the sudden fear clawing at Cassidy's own throat. But he followed his master inside. He would always follow. The office didn't smell like an old, abandoned building. It didn't have that familiar scent of dust and decay. It smelled wrong. It was a sharp, chemical odor. Bleach, so strong it burned the back of his throat. And underneath the bleach, something else. Something metallic and coppery. The smell of old pennies. Or old blood. Sunlight forced its way through tiny gaps in the boarded-up windows, cutting dusty yellow beams through the gloom. The dust motes didn't just float, they seemed to dance, to swirl in patterns that looked almost alive. Behind the check-in counter was an old leather chair, the kind of deep brown cracked leather that speaks of decades of use. And on the counter, a registration book lay open. Its pages were yellowed, the corners curled. Cassidy ran a finger over the brittle paper, expecting to see dates from a decade ago, from a time when this place was alive. But the last entry wasn't old at all. It was dated just 3 weeks ago. Room 15. The name was J. Morrison. No address, no license plate, just a name and a room number. Who was J. Morrison, and why was he staying in a derelict motel in the middle of nowhere? A low growl from Duke ripped his attention away from the book. The dog was standing rigid in the middle of the room. His ears were flat against his skull, his tail tucked so far between his legs it was almost gone. He wasn't looking at the door, or the windows, or Cassidy. He was staring at the floor behind the counter. Just staring. "What is it, boy?" Cassidy whispered. He moved around the counter, his boots making hollow sounds on the floorboards. Duke scrambled backward, a whine catching in his throat. He wouldn't come any closer. Cassidy looked down. The floorboards here, they were different. He knelt, the smell of bleach and old metal getting stronger. He pressed his hand against the wood. It felt hollow underneath. Empty. Then he saw it. The color was just a shade off from the rest of the floor. The wood grain ran in a slightly different direction. These boards were newer. Someone had replaced this section of the floor, and they had done a careful job trying to hide it, but not careful enough. He ran his fingers along the seams, feeling for an imperfection. And there it was. A thin gap, no wider than a credit card, where two boards didn't quite meet. He pressed down. Click. The sound was soft, but in the dead silence of that room, it was as loud as a gunshot. A section of the floor shifted, just a fraction of an inch. He saw the glint of hidden hinges. It wasn't just a patch job. It was a trapdoor. With a deep breath, Cassidy lifted the wooden panel. A wave of cold, foul air rushed up from the darkness below, a nauseating cocktail that made his stomach heave. The chemical smell was a monster now, mixed with the stench of damp earth, rotting carpet, and something else. Something sickeningly familiar. It was the smell of the old barn back home after a hard winter, when small creatures would crawl into the walls to die. Steep wooden stairs led down into absolute blackness. The walls on either side were rough, unfinished concrete. He could see the first few steps, but after that, the darkness was a solid wall. It didn't just hide what was below. It swallowed the light. Behind him, Duke began to pace, his whining growing frantic, his claws clicking nervously on the floor. The dog's fear was no longer a quiet trembling. It was a raw, primal terror, and Cassidy knew he should listen to it. Animals see things we don't. They feel things we can't. He had learned to trust Duke's instincts a long time ago. They had saved his life more than once, but he couldn't stop now. Standing there, peering down into that hidden hole beneath the Desert Rose Motel, Cassidy felt a cold certainty settle over him. It was the same feeling he'd had the day he buried his wife. The feeling that his world was about to be split in two, and he would never be able to go back to the man he was before. The stairs groaned as his boot touched the first step. Duke's whining rose to a desperate howl behind him, but the darkness was pulling him in, demanding answers to questions he was terrified to ask. What happened down there? Who was Jay Morrison? And why would someone go to such lengths to hide this place, only to sell it for $50? The wooden stairs creaked under his weight, each sound a gunshot in the suffocating silence. The concrete walls seemed to sweat, closing in around him as he descended deeper into the earth. The air got colder, thicker, that bleach and metal smell burning his lungs. It felt like he was climbing down the throat of some dead thing. At the bottom, he pulled out his phone, the flashlight app casting a weak, pale beam into the oppressive dark. The space that opened up before him was bigger than he'd imagined. The basement ran nearly the full length of the office above. The concrete walls were stained with dark, ugly patches that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. Metal pipes snaked across the low ceiling, a strange mix of old, rusted iron and new, gleaming copper. Someone had been doing work down here, making upgrades. But it was the floor that made Cassidy's breath catch in his chest. The concrete was covered in scratches, deep, parallel gouges dug into the solid floor. They weren't from an animal. They were too wide, too deliberate. They looked like they had been made by fingernails. Human fingernails, scraping and clawing at the concrete in a desperate final act of terror. He could almost see the bloody stumps, the raw panic. Suddenly he realized something else. It was quiet. Too quiet. Above him, Duke's frantic whining had stopped. The silence that replaced it was 100 times worse. "Duke?" he called out, his voice sounding small and weak, swallowed by the thick, dead air of the basement. No answer, no bark, no answering whine, just silence. His light swept across the far wall, landing on a workbench. It was crudely built from cinder blocks and rough-cut lumber, but the tools hanging from the pegboard above it were anything but crude. Pliers, wire cutters, a small hacksaw, and other stranger items he couldn't immediately identify, things with hooks and sharp edges whose purposes he did not want to imagine. Everything was neat, organized, clean. This wasn't a forgotten workshop. It was used, regularly. On the corner of the bench sat a neatly folded stack of newspapers. He picked one up. The date was only 2 months ago. The headline screamed in thick black letters, "Local woman still missing after 3 weeks." He scanned the article, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs. Below it, a smaller story. Search continues for traveling salesman. His hands started to shake as he flipped through the stack. It was a graveyard of headlines, more missing people, and more, all from the last year, all last seen traveling through this exact stretch of desolate highway. Drifters, tourists, people who wouldn't be missed right away. The beam of his flashlight caught a glint of metal in the corner of the room. It was a heavy iron ring, bolted directly into the concrete wall. A thick rusted chain was attached to it. The links of the chain were worn smooth in places, as if something, or someone, had pulled against it, over and over again. And around the bolt, the concrete was scarred with fresh scratches. This wasn't an abandoned basement. This was a cage. This was a tomb. This explained everything. The $50 price tag. The auctioneer's pity. Duke's absolute terror. Someone was using this place. And they had been here recently. Cassidy scrambled back toward the stairs, a cold lump of ice forming in his stomach. He had to get out. He had to get to Duke. As his foot hit the bottom step, a sound from above froze him solid. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps creaking across the office floorboards. They weren't the nervous clicks of a dog's claws. They were heavy, purposeful. The sound of work boots. Cassidy killed his phone's light, plunging the basement back into total darkness. He flattened himself against the cold concrete wall, holding his breath, listening. The footsteps stopped directly over the trapdoor. A shadow fell over the rectangle of light from the office above, blocking it out. He heard the soft groan of wood as someone shifted their weight. Then a voice called down into the darkness. It was calm, conversational, almost friendly. "I see you found my workshop." The words shot through Cassidy like a bolt of lightning. This person, whoever they were, they knew he was down here. They had been waiting. The newspapers, the chains, the missing people. It all snapped into a picture of absolute horror. And Duke. Duke was up there with him. Cassidy didn't breathe. He didn't move a muscle. He tried to melt into the shadows of the concrete tomb. The man's voice was the scariest thing he'd ever heard. Not because it was angry, but because it was so calm. It was the voice of a man completely in control. "You can come up now," the voice continued, as if inviting him for coffee. "No point hiding down there. I know exactly where you are." He heard the heavy tread of boots moving across the floor again, the soft thud of something being set down, the scrape of a chair being dragged across the wood. The man was getting comfortable. He was setting the stage. "Your dog's a real pretty fella," the voice called down again. The casual tone was chilling. "Big boy, friendly too. Came right up to me when I whistled. Dogs always trust the wrong people, don't they?" Cassidy's blood turned to ice. A lie. It had to be a lie. Duke, in the state of terror he was in, would never approach a stranger. Not willingly. Unless the man had hurt him, trapped him. "Nothing's happened to him," the man said, his voice seeming to crawl right inside Cassidy's head. "Yet. But that can change real quick if you don't start climbing those stairs." His hand instinctively went to the .38 pistol on his hip, his fingers wrapped around the familiar cold steel of the grip. It was some comfort, but not much. He was trapped in a concrete box with one way out, and a monster was waiting for him at the top. The smart play was to stay put, try his phone. But he already knew. He pulled it out, the screen's glow a tiny beacon of false hope. No signal. Of course not. This deep. It was like being buried alive. And every second he waited was another second Duke was in danger. "I'm gonna count to 10, the voice announced, the friendly tone gone now, replaced by a cold, hard edge. "When I get to 10, your pretty dog starts paying for your bad manners. 1, 2. Cassidy couldn't wait. He started up the stairs, his pistol drawn but held low against his leg, trying to move without a sound. Each creak of the old wood was a scream in the silence. This wasn't a staircase, it was a gallows. 3. 4. Smart man, I can hear you coming. At the top of the stairs, just below the opening of the trap door, Cassidy paused. He could see the floor of the office now, bathed in the afternoon light. He couldn't see the man, not from this angle, but he could see his boots. Worn, steel-toed work boots, caked in dirt. The kind a man who works with his hands, and the earth, would wear. 5. 6. Don't make me get impatient. Cassidy took one last ragged breath and launched himself up out of the hole, gun raised, ready to face the devil. The man was standing behind the reception counter. He looked ordinary. Faded denim jacket, worn work pants, middle-aged, average height, with thinning brown hair tucked under a dusty baseball cap. He was the kind of guy you'd see at a hardware store and forget a minute later. There was nothing threatening about him at all, except for the high-powered rifle in his hands, and it was pointed directly at Duke. His beautiful Great Dane was lying on his side near the door. His chest was rising and falling, so he was alive. But he was motionless. There were no wounds, no blood. The man had done something to him. "Tranquilizer," the man said, a thin, unsettling smile playing on his lips. He'd seen Cassidy's eyes lock on the dog. "Learned how to dose 'em right when I worked for animal control. Your boy will be fine in a few hours, assuming he lives that long." "What do you want?" Cassidy's voice was a low growl, his pistol steady, aimed at the man's chest. "What I want," the man said slowly, his smile widening, "is for you to put that little pea shooter on the counter. Then we're gonna have a nice long talk. About minding your own business. I bought this place. It is my business." The man chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Legal's got nothing to do with it, friend. Some things can't be bought and sold. Some things, they just belong to whoever's strong enough to keep 'em." "The people in those newspapers," Cassidy said, his throat tight. "You killed them." "I solved problems," the man corrected him. "Same way I'm about to solve you, unless you start cooperating." Cassidy's mind was racing, but he kept the gun level. This man had all the advantages. He was on his home turf. He'd clearly done this before. The calm demeanor, the pre-filled tranquilizer dart, the confidence in his eyes. This was a well-rehearsed performance. "The name's Judson Pryor," the man said, as if they were meeting at a town picnic. "I've been the caretaker of this place for about 8 years now. I keep it clean. Maintain the equipment downstairs. And I make sure the right kind of people find their way to my little slice of heaven." "You mean victims?" Judson shrugged. "I mean people who won't be missed. Drifters, runaways, folks traveling alone who didn't tell a soul where they were going. It's amazing how many people just vanish out here in the desert. Nobody even asks." Just then, Duke stirred. One massive paw twitched. His tail gave a weak thump against the floor. The tranquilizer was wearing off. It was wearing off faster than Judson had anticipated. Cassidy saw a flicker of annoyance in the man's eyes. He needed to buy more time. "How did you know I was coming?" Cassidy asked, keeping his voice steady. "Same way I know about all the others. I put in a bid on this place at every single auction, just enough to keep it in my name. Then I pull out, make sure the price stays so low that only someone truly desperate would buy it. Then I wait. Judson shifted the rifle, the barrel never wavering from Duke. You weren't supposed to find the basement so quick, though. Most folks take a few days to get curious about the strange smell in the office. The key turned too easily, Cassidy said. The lock was oiled. A flicker of genuine appreciation crossed Judson's face. Sharp eye. Most people don't notice the little details, not until it's far too late. His awful smile returned. I keep the locks oiled, the hinges quiet, makes everything run much smoother when the time comes. How many? Cassidy's voice was barely a whisper. How many what? How many people have you killed? Judson tilted his head, as if genuinely considering the question. Well now, are we counting the original owners? Because technically, I just inherited the place from them, after their little accident. The casual, boastful way he spoke of murder made Cassidy's stomach churn. But his eyes were on Duke. The dog's breathing was deeper now, more regular. His eyes were still closed, but his muscles were tensing, gathering. He was coming back. Put the gun down, Judson repeated, his voice losing its friendly edge. We're going to take a walk down to the basement, you and me. And you're going to learn how things work around here. If you're a good student, maybe you'll last longer than the others. Maybe, Cassidy said, his eyes flicking from Judson to the dog. You should look at my dog again. Judson's eyes, just for a fraction of a second, glanced down at the stirring Great Dane. And in that split second, the world exploded. Duke erupted from the floor. He wasn't a dog anymore. He was a 140-pound missile of white and black fury. He launched himself not at Judson's legs, but at his rifle arm. The rifle discharged with a deafening blast as Duke's weight slammed into him, the bullet shattering the office window in a spray of glass. Judson screamed, a sound of rage and surprise, as the dog's momentum drove him backward into the wall. The rifle spun out of his grasp, clattering across the floor. Cassidy dove for it. But Judson was shockingly fast. He rolled with the impact, shoving the dog aside. A blade appeared in his hand, a long, wicked-looking hunting knife. He slashed out, catching Duke across the shoulder. A red line blossomed through the dog's white fur. Duke yelped in pain and staggered back. It was just enough room for Judson to scramble for the door. Cassidy thought he was running. He was wrong. Judson didn't run. He turned back, his face a mask of fury. And in his hand was something that made Cassidy's blood freeze solid in his veins. A grenade, olive drab, military issue. The pin was already gone. You want to play rough? Judson snarled, his voice no longer calm and controlled, but ragged with madness. Let's all go together. Time seemed to warp, stretching and slowing down until every heartbeat was a drumbeat of doom. Cassidy stared at the grenade. Judson's thumb was pressed hard against the safety lever, the only thing keeping them all from being turned into a red mist. 5 seconds. 5 seconds after he let go of that lever, their story would be over. Easy now, Judson breathed, his voice steady again, but his eyes were wild, unhinged. Nobody has to die today. Not if you do exactly as I say. Duke whimpered, blood now seeping freely from the deep gash on his shoulder. His legs were shaking, a horrible combination of the tranquilizer's lingering effects and searing pain. But his eyes, full of hate, never left Judson. Here's what's going to happen, Judson said, backing slowly toward the office door, keeping the grenade held out where Cassidy could see it. You're going to put your gun on that counter, nice and slow. Then you're going to help me get your mutt into one of the motel rooms. After that, we'll discuss your new living arrangements. Cassidy's mind was a whirlwind of impossible choices. Rush him? The grenade would detonate. Shoot him? The moment his hand went limp, the lever would release. Let him walk? He'd be gone, and they'd be trapped here with no way to call for help. There were no good options. The rooms, Cassidy said, stalling, trying to buy even a few seconds for his mind to work. They're not all empty, are they? Judson's sick smile crawled back onto his face. Smart question. Some are occupied. Some are vacant. Really just depends on how cooperative my guests have been. He gestured with his free hand toward the door. Gun. On the counter. Now. With his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, Cassidy placed his pistol on the dusty counter. The soft clink of metal on wood sounded like a death sentence. Good boy, Judson sneered. Now we're all going to take a little walk outside. You, me, and your bleeding dog. And if you even think about trying something heroic, we all meet our maker in a big loud flash. It was a nightmare procession. They moved out into the blinding afternoon sun, Cassidy half carrying the wounded Duke, whose every step left a crimson drop on the dusty ground. The motel courtyard felt like a stage, and they were the unwilling actors in Judson's final bloody act. The 2 stories of dilapidated rooms watched them like rows of silent, dead-eyed spectators. Room 15, Judson directed, nodding toward a door on the ground floor. That's where your friend Jay Morrison stayed, right up until he stopped being useful. As they got closer, Cassidy saw that this door was different. It was reinforced with heavy steel brackets. The window next to it wasn't just boarded up, it was sealed from the inside. This wasn't a motel room. It was a prison cell. Judson fumbled with a ring of keys, hooking it with his teeth to select the right one, his thumb never leaving the grenade's safety lever. Open it, he commanded. Cassidy's hand trembled as he turned the key. He pushed the heavy door inward. The smell that rolled out was the smell of pure despair. Stale sweat, raw fear, and human waste, all baked together by the desert sun. It was the scent of a place where people had been kept for a very, very long time. The room was stripped bare, nothing but a stained mattress on the floor and a plastic bucket in the corner. Home sweet home, Judson said. Get inside. The dog needs a vet, Cassidy pleaded. He's losing a lot of blood. The dog needs to learn some manners, Judson snarled. Get inside, or I'll put him out of his misery right here, right now. Cassidy had no choice. He helped Duke over the threshold. The Great Dane collapsed onto the filthy mattress, his panting shallow and ragged. The second they were both inside, Judson slammed the steel-reinforced door shut. The heavy sound of the metal brackets sliding into place echoed in the tiny dark room. It was the sound of a tomb being sealed. They were trapped. Outside, Cassidy heard Judson's boots crunching away across the gravel. Then the sound of a truck engine starting up and driving away. And then, silence. A silence so complete, so heavy, it felt like being buried alive. The silence in that concrete box was a living thing. It pressed in on Cassidy, broken only by Duke's shallow, labored breathing. He knelt by his friend, the only light coming from thin cracks in the boarded-up window. The gash on Duke's shoulder was bad. It was clean, but it was deep, right into the muscle. Cassidy tore a long strip from his own shirt and pressed it hard against the wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. Stay with me, boy, he whispered, his voice cracking. We're getting out of here, I promise you. Duke's eyes, clouded with pain, never left his face. He was still fighting. Cassidy looked around their prison. The room was a testament to suffering. The concrete walls were covered in scratches, the frantic marks of fingernails trying to claw their way to freedom. The floor was dark with stains he knew were old blood. And carved into the wooden doorframe was a series of tiny lines. Tally marks. Someone had been counting the days. Days they would never get back. Jay Morrison had been in this room, and so many others before him. Judson hadn't just bought a motel. He'd built his own private hunting ground, a place where the lost could be found, and then lost forever. Cassidy checked every inch of the cell. The walls were solid cinder block. The door was a slab of reinforced steel. The only possible way out was the window, but the thick wooden planks had been nailed shut from the outside, then braced with metal. It was hopeless. Just as that thought crossed his mind, he heard it. The sound of a vehicle returning. His blood ran cold. Judson was back. He heard footsteps, the familiar crunch of boots on gravel. But there was another sound this time, a heavy, dragging sound, like a sack of potatoes being pulled across the courtyard. The footsteps stopped right outside their door. "Hope you're getting comfortable in there," Judson's voice called out, laced with a sick, cheerful tone. "Brought a friend of yours out here. Wants to say hello." Cassidy scrambled to the window, pressing his eye to a crack between the boards. What he saw made his stomach turn to lead. A woman lay unconscious in the dirt. Her hands were zip-tied behind her back. She was wearing a business suit, now torn and covered in dust. A set of car keys glinted on the ground beside her. Another one. Another soul who took a wrong turn into Judson's twisted world. "Found her broke down about 10 miles up the highway," Judson continued, his voice conversational, as if he were talking about the weather. "Engine trouble. Amazing how grateful folks can be when a good Samaritan offers them a tow." The woman stirred. Her eyes fluttered open. Cassidy watched the confusion on her face melt into pure, undiluted terror as she took in her surroundings, the gag in her mouth, the zip ties cutting into her wrists. She tried to scream, but the sound was a muffled, desperate whimper. "Now, here's the deal." Judson's voice cut through the woman's terrified cries. "You and your oversized mutt have caused me a considerable amount of trouble today. Cost me time, cost me effort. So now, you're going to make it up to me." Judson had positioned himself perfectly. He was standing where he could see their door and the captive woman at the same time. He was in complete control. "I'm going to give you a choice," he went on. "You can stay locked in that box until you starve to death. Or, you can come out and help me with my new guest. You know, show her the ropes. Explain how things work around here." The woman's muffled screams grew louder. She understood now. She understood what kind of place this was. "Of course," Judson added, his voice dropping to a sinister purr. "If you're not interested in being helpful, I can always find other uses for your new friend. Some people pay good money for a little company, and she's a whole lot prettier than most of the trash I get through here." Duke, weak as he was, tried to raise his head. A low, menacing growl rumbled in his chest. Even injured and dying, the instinct to protect an innocent was too strong to ignore. "You've got 1 hour to decide," Judson shouted. "After that, I start getting creative." Cassidy stared through the crack, his heart a block of ice in his chest. The woman was struggling against her bonds. A business card had fallen out of her jacket pocket. It lay in the dust, close enough for him to read the name. Sarah Chen, regional sales manager. She had a life, a job, a family, people who were expecting her home. She wasn't a nameless drifter. She would be missed. He looked back at Duke. The makeshift bandage was soaked through, a deep, horrifying crimson. The dog's breathing was getting shallower. He didn't have a day. He probably didn't have hours. But helping Judson? Becoming a part of his sickening game? It was unthinkable. Cassidy's eyes went back to the boarded-up window. He ran his fingers along the edges of the planks. The wood was old, brittle from decades of desert sun. The nails were long and rusted. In a few places, they seemed to have worked themselves a little loose from the frame. If he just had some kind of leverage? His eyes fell on the metal bucket in the corner. It was heavy-gauge steel, with a thick, rolled rim. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He jammed the rim of the bucket into the gap between the board and the window frame, and pushed with all his might. The rusted nail groaned, shifting just a millimeter. Outside, Judson had started talking to Sarah Chen. He was using that same calm, reasonable voice he'd used on Cassidy, explaining his rules, describing in graphic detail what would happen to her if she didn't cooperate. Her muffled cries had turned into hopeless, gut-wrenching sobs. Cassidy worked like a man possessed. He pushed and pried, using the bucket as a crowbar, ignoring the pain as the rough metal tore at his hands. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. Behind him, Duke let out a soft whimper, as if he knew his master was fighting for their lives. With a loud crack that echoed like a rifle shot, the first board ripped free. Cassidy froze, his heart hammering. He listened, but Judson was still talking, his voice a steady, monstrous drone. He hadn't heard it. The second board was tougher. The nails were newer, driven deeper. Cassidy's hands were raw and bleeding, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Duke's life, Sarah's life, depended on it. Time's up. Judson's voice suddenly boomed across the courtyard. Cassidy's blood turned to ice. It hadn't been an hour. Not even close. Judson was bored. He was moving up the timeline. "So what's it gonna be?" Judson shouted. "Are you gonna be helpful? Or do I need to start motivating you?" Sarah's muffled scream was sharp, desperate. Just as Cassidy heard the sickening scrape of the metal brackets being pulled away from their door, the second board gave way. Judson was coming in. "Come on, boy," Cassidy whispered, grabbing Duke under his massive shoulders. He half lifted, half dragged the injured dog toward the window. The opening was small, probably too small for a man, and definitely too small for a Great Dane in this condition. But it was their only chance. Duke seemed to understand. With a surge of adrenaline, he pushed himself forward, his massive frame scraping against the splintered wood of the window frame. Blood from his shoulder smeared across the sill. The room door burst open with a crash. "What the?" Judson's curse was cut off as Cassidy squeezed through the narrow opening right behind his dog. They were out, but they weren't free. They were standing in the open courtyard, exposed. Judson knew every inch of this place, and Duke was leaving a bright red trail in the dust for him to follow. Worse, Sarah Chen was still tied up, a terrified witness to their escape. Judson appeared at the broken window, his face a grotesque mask of pure rage. "You can run!" he screamed, his voice cracking with fury. "But there's nowhere to hide out here, and when I find you, your dog dies slow." Cassidy hauled Duke behind the rusted-out shell of an old pickup truck abandoned in the parking lot. The dog's breathing was a faint, shallow rattle. The white fur of his coat was matted with blood and desert dust. They needed a doctor. They needed a miracle. But the nearest town was 40 miles of empty highway away. They'd never make it. He heard Judson's boots crunching on the gravel, getting closer. The man wasn't rushing. He was hunting. Moving with a slow, methodical patience that was far more terrifying than any panicked chase. He was checking behind each abandoned car, behind each crumbling wall. "I see your blood trail," Judson called out, his voice a sing-song taunt. "It's leading me right to you. Might as well come on out. Make this easy on yourselves." Cassidy fumbled for his phone, knowing it was useless, but trying anyway. No signal, not a single bar. The desert didn't just swallow secrets, it swallowed cries for help. And that's when Duke did the bravest thing Cassidy had ever seen. With a groan of pain that tore at Cassidy's soul, the Great Dane struggled to his feet. He looked back at Cassidy, a deep, knowing look in his eyes. And then he limped away from their hiding spot. He wasn't running. He was deliberately walking out into the open, leaving a clear, obvious trail of blood and paw prints in the soft sand, leading away from Cassidy. He was creating a diversion. He was sacrificing himself. "Duke, no!" Cassidy whispered, his voice choked with anguish. But the dog just kept going, a noble, tragic figure limping toward his own death. Judson took the bait. Cassidy heard his footsteps change direction, quickening now as he followed the fresh trail around the far side of the motel. The moment Judson was out of sight, Cassidy sprinted. He ran not for his own freedom, but for Sarah Chen. She was still tied up near the office, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and desperate hope as he skidded to a halt beside her. He grabbed a shard of broken glass from the shattered office window, and sawed at her zip ties. "Can you drive?" he whispered urgently, pulling the duct tape from her mouth. "Yes," she gasped, rubbing her raw wrists. "My car. Where are the keys?" "He threw them somewhere," she sobbed. "In the office, I think." Cassidy's heart plummeted. The office. Judson's den. It was a trap. But without the keys, they were both dead. A single gunshot cracked through the desert air from behind the motel. It was followed by a high-pitched, agonized yelp of pain. Duke's yelp. Something inside Cassidy snapped. The fear, the calculation, the strategy, it all burned away, replaced by a white-hot, blinding rage. He didn't care about stealth anymore. He didn't care about the trap. Judson had shot his dog. Nothing else mattered. He burst through the office door like a man possessed. And there they were, the car keys, glinting on the counter, right next to his own .38 revolver. "Smart dog," a voice said from the doorway behind him. Cassidy whirled around, grabbing his gun from the counter. Judson stood there, framed in the doorway, his rifle raised and leveled. Behind him, in the dust of the courtyard, Duke lay completely still. "Knew exactly what he was doing," Judson sneered, a triumphant smile on his face. "Led me right back to you." "Drop it," Judson commanded. Instead, Cassidy pulled the trigger. The .38 bucked in his hand, the explosion deafening in the small office. The bullet hit Judson square in the chest. The sneer on the killer's face vanished, replaced by a look of pure, stupid surprise. He staggered back a step, trying to lift his own rifle. Cassidy fired again. And again. He emptied the cylinder, the gun clicking uselessly as Judson Pryor, the caretaker of the Desert Rose Motel, collapsed in the doorway of his own personal slaughterhouse, his dead eyes staring up at the empty desert sky. Cassidy didn't even look at him. He ran to Duke, falling to his knees beside his friend's motionless body. "No, no, no," he chanted, his hands searching for the wound, expecting the worst. But then he saw it. The bullet had only grazed the side of the Great Dane's thick skull. It had knocked him unconscious, but it hadn't killed him. A heartbeat. Faint, but it was there. Duke was still breathing. He was still alive. The roar of an engine brought him back. Sarah Chen was behind the wheel of her car. She'd had the presence of mind to take the keys from Judson's pocket. "Hospital!" Cassidy yelled, gently, carefully lifting all 140 pounds of his unconscious hero into the back seat. "No, a vet. There's a veterinary clinic in the next town." 3 hours later, Duke woke up from surgery with 17 stitches, a concussion, and a clean bill of health. The vet looked at Cassidy, his eyes wide with amazement. "Another inch to the left," he said, "and this dog would be dead. He's the luckiest animal I've ever seen." Cassidy knew it wasn't luck. It was courage. The police later found the remains of 11 people buried in shallow graves behind the Desert Rose Motel. 11 souls who had trusted the wrong man, who had stopped at the wrong place, and had disappeared forever into Judson Pryor's twisted world. Cassidy sold the motel property to the state for $1. They tore it down and turned it into a memorial park for the victims. He used the money from his own savings to open a large animal rescue shelter on the edge of town. He named it Duke's Haven, in honor of the brave dog who had walked into the darkness and led him back into the light. Some places, it seems, are born from darkness. They hold on to it, they fester with it. But every now and then, with enough courage and enough loyalty, the light finds a way to win. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of survival against all odds. And if you have a story about a heroic animal in your own life, share it in the comments below. We'd love to read it. Your support helps us keep finding and telling these incredible stories.